Okay, next we're going to speak about dynamic protocol inspection on the ASA via MPF. Now, first of all, what are dynamic protocols? So it's going to be protocols that rely on multiple sessions to work. And this is something like the dynamic connection of those two sessions. It's something like, in most cases, it applies to all protocols. Like first, we're gonna have a control plane session which is fired up between two end hosts. They negotiate something in between, and then they fire up a second session which is called like the data plane session. It can have one or multiple second data plane sessions. One such simple example is FTP or TFTP. So via both FTP and TFTP, first the client connects to the server via the control plane session. The client authenticates, it reads the directory, and then when the client wants to download something from the FTP or TFTP server, it's going to fire up a second session, which is the transfer or data plane session. That's going to be a new session which is initiated. It depends if it's going to be initiated by the server or the client. We're going to speak with FTP in a couple of seconds. So pretty much we have a couple of protocols like, for example, TFTP and FTP, that when we make use of those protocols, they don't rely on a single session like Telnet does. Telnet means that is going to fire up a connection on TCP port 23 destination port, and that's it. It doesn't have any secondary sessions, or SSH is the same thing. But other protocols like FTP or TFTP, they build multiple sessions. It's going to be, in case of FTP and TFTP, we have one control plane session where the client authenticates, reads the directory, and then when we want to download something from the FTP or TFTP server, we fire up a secondary session. So what is the challenge with these protocols, and why do we need the ASA to support those protocols and to inspect them? For example, so currently we have the security levels to be 0 in here and 50 in here. And if we make PCB to be an FTP client, like we did, is going to be the same thing as we did on ASA Firewall, and server A to be the FTP server. Then when PCB fires up the control plane session, it's going to be allowed because I have an inbound ACL on that inside interface which allows all IP traffic to flow between VLAN 33 and VLAN 91. That's going to be the control plane session where the client authenticates to the server and reads the directory. That is going to work. But then, like in the case of we saw in the zone-based policy firewall, the same case applies in here. If that FTP connection runs in active mode, it means that when the client wants to download something from the server, if the FTP connection runs in active mode, it means that that transfer session, the data plane, the secondary session, is initiated by the server. Or the secondary session is initiated by the server, and that's happening in active mode, and it's initiated by the server on source port of 20, with source port of 20. Now that data plane session, it's a new session, and session that traffic flows 50 to 100, which means that if the ASA does not inspect FTP, it is going to drop that session. Because it's a new session, and ASA says, well, the security levels don't allow the session, the ACLs doesn't allow the session, then I'm going to drop the session. But if the ASA inspects FTP, which it does by default, if the ASA inspects FTP, just like we saw in the case of zone-based policy firewall, if it inspects FTP, it is going to inspect or snoop on the control plane session. Let me delete this for a second in here. So if we perform FTP inspection via MPF, when the control plane session is being built, the ASA sends that packet over to MPF inspection. All that session, the control plane session, is constantly being inspected by MPF, the control plane session. Which means that the ASA is aware of how do the client and the server negotiate to run FTP. Is it active mode or is it passive mode? And what are the ports that they negotiate to run the data plane session over? So because the ASA does that, it inspects that, then it is going to accept that because they negotiated to run in active mode, it is going to expect that server A is going to initiate the data plane session over to PCB, a new session, or the data plane session, a new session, or a source port of 20. And even if that's a new session, and even if it flows 50 to 100, which is not allowed, technically speaking, even if there's no ACL to allow that traffic flow, this session is allowed through the ASA as a child session associated to that parent control plane session. So pretty much what it means is that when we inspect FTP on the ASA, as long as the FTP control plane session works, which means it's allowed by the firewall policies, then that is going to create an entry in the connection table. And if we inspect FTP, what it means is that ASA is going to automatically allow the data plane session, which is going to create a new entry in the connection table, because the ASA has inspected the control plane session, and it knows how the client and server are running, passive active mode, and it knows who's going to initiate the data plane session, the server or the client, and on which ports, and is going to accept that session without, just like that. The secondary session doesn't need to be allowed by any security levels or any ACL configuration. It is dynamically, automatically allowed to work. So as I said, the control plane session has to be allowed by the security levels or configured ACLs. And if protocols with dynamic secondary sessions are inspected via MPF, then ASA will snoop or inspect the control plane session at the application layer to see how do the source and destination of the packet, how do those negotiate to run the application, like is the FTP running in passive or client or active mode, which means who's going to initiate the data plane session and over which ports, and then the secondary session is automatically allowed by the ASA to flow through. Now by default, ASA inspects via MPF most of the protocols that have dynamic sessions. Like for example, it's not all of them which are inspected by default. For example, FTP is inspected by default to allow the secondary data transfer session. H323, RTSP, SCCP, or SIP, which are signaling or control plane protocols for pretty much voice or video traffic. Those are being inspected so that ESA is going to automatically allow secondary RTP sessions to the ESA, which that's going to be the actual voice call or the actual video call. Because first, between in a voice call or in a video call, first likewise we have a control plane session. We negotiate the codecs, which codec version to use, what is the protocol what is the sending protocol, and then after we have negotiated how to run that session, that voice call, that video call, then we actually fire up the RTP session, which is the actual, like for example, the actual voice call. So ASA by default inspects HTTP, RTSP, SCCP, or SIP, so that it's going to inspect the control plane session of those protocols in order to allow the secondary sessions, which are going to be RTP sessions. Or for example, Oracle SQL is likewise inspected by default to allow dynamic secondary database connections. Because how Oracle works is that I'm going to connect to a specific port that the database is listening on, and then additional, based on what I'm doing to the database, additional connections may be fired up, which likewise I'm doing that inspection to allow those secondary connections to work. Some protocols which are not inspected by default, and they also have secondary sessions, are CTI QBE, MMP, MGCP, and DCE RPC. So also those protocols have secondary sessions, and those are not inspected by default. So if it's the case that you have those protocols, that kind of traffic flowing through the ASA, you have to enable the inspection for those protocols. Now, configuration wise, we just enabled dynamic protocol inspection via MPF, of course, for protocols not inspected by default. If the inspected protocol does not run on standard ports, like FTP runs on port 2121, not on port 21, then we have to configure the ASA to inspect that protocol, like the FTP protocol, on the non-default port or on the non-standard port. Because by default, when we inspect, as you're going to see in a couple, when we inspect those protocols, we inspect those protocols on their default native ports. Which means if we run those protocols on other non-standard ports, we have to tell the ASA to know that traffic on a port of 9000, it's FTP, for example. Like if we go on the ASA and we say show run policy map. So as you can see, by default, ASA inspects FTP and H223, so that the secondary sessions are going to work through the ASA. It inspects likewise RSH and RTSP and Skinny. All of those protocols likewise have secondary sessions. It inspects SQLnet for Oracle and TFTP and SIP, which also both of them have secondary sessions. So the main reason I'm inspecting those protocols is just to allow secondary sessions to flow through as well, or also XD, MCP likewise. So pretty much a lot of within that list of inspected protocols, a lot of them are inspected just to make sure that secondary sessions of those protocols are allowed by the ASA. Like these protocols, and also this protocol. And I think also Sun RPC has a secondary session as well. I'm not 100% sure about Sun RPC. So pretty much all of the default inspections are just to make sure that traffic works through the ASA pretty much, because all of those protocols have secondary sessions being built. Of course, just like we saw in the case of Arizona-based policy firewall, if this session runs in passive mode, but this is only specific to FTP, if this session runs in passive mode between the FTP client and the FTP server, then both the control plane session and data plane sessions are initiated by the client. In this case, I still need FTP inspection, because otherwise both sessions have to be allowed by the ASA security levels or the ASA's interface ACLs. If I don't do FTP inspection, then as I stated, both of those sessions have to be allowed by the ASA security levels or the ASA interface ACLs or global ACLs. If I inspect FTP, only the control plane session has to be allowed by the security levels or the ASA ACLs, Because if I inspect FTP, as long as the control plane session is allowed, data plane session likewise is going to be automatically allowed. Doesn't matter who initiates the session. So now I'm inspecting FTP. Let's run FTP in active mode, which means that the session between PCB and server A should work, where the control plane is initiated by PCB. It is going to be allowed because of the inbound ACL on this interface as configured before. And then because I inspect FTP, the data play session which is initiated, the transfer session which is initiated by server A back to the client, it is also going to be allowed because I inspect FTP. Let's confirm that. Let's go on PCB and connect via FTP to server A. Well, for whatever reason, it seems that on this PC I don't have the FTP client configured. Let me go quickly on. It's going to take me just a couple of seconds. Let me quickly go on PCA, which is 10.10.11.100. Let me quickly go on ASA tree and say show route include 10.10.11.100. Let's go on router 1 and add temporarily 10.10.11.100 in router edge IP. Or maybe I have the FTP client. I should have it. Let's see if I have it on server A. Let's confirm if I have the FTP client on server A. I'm going into lab files. In the FTP, let's go to FileZilla, and we have that in there. Okay, let's go and make sure that this folder is being shared. It should be sharing. Let's share it real fast. Share this folder. Name, lab files, permissions, everyone, full control, apply, okay, and close. Let's go on test PCB and browse to server A to quickly install the FTP client. Let's go to lab files, to FileZilla, and let's quickly install FTP client. Let's make sure no traffic is being dropped. Show logging, include 172.16.10.100. Build, tear down, so it should be okay. There we go, run. Okay, finish. And let's run the client and let's configure the client to run in active mode. So let's say file, edit network configuration wizard. Let's say next. And let's run in active mode, not passive. Don't allow fallback to auto transfer mode on failure. Next. Next. I shouldn't have said test network configuration wizard. So I'm just configuring to run in active mode without fallback on passive. Meanwhile, let's go on server A and configure the server, or open up the server. And let's say server, let's say edit settings. So I have, let's make sure edit users, not settings. I have that username of Cisco with a shared folder of, let's say, remove, add, and let's add a shell folder of lab files, and then let's add the FileZilla folder, for example. Okay. Okay. Let's go on PCB. Connection closed. Okay, let's say next, finish. Now let's connect on server A, 172.16.10.100. Before we do that, let's go on the ASA and say show service policy, inspect FTP. So we do by default FTP inspection, and no packet have matched my FTP inspection policy because no FTP traffic has been seen by the ASA.